Hi, this is John Rowell for the Rowell Report. I hope you're having a great day. In this video, I'm going to talk about the moment I knew that the Iraq War was a lie. So I'm going to go through my thinking process and what was going on in Iraq at the time. So if you remember back regarding the first Iraq War, in which Iraq invaded Kuwait, at the end of that war, there was a no-fly zone that was created in the north and south of Iraq. And basically, those zones were patrolled by Allied planes. And if there was a government project anywhere in that area, and they began to build one brick on top of another, the fighter jets were already flying in this area, and they would just simply take out whatever that construction was. So airstrikes were quite frequent in this no-fly zone as the Allies looked to the last little centimeter of what was going on in those areas. It was very highly monitored. So I knew that if there were any weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein had, there was a high probability that they were not anywhere in the no-fly zones, because they wouldn't be able to get to them without being noticed. They wouldn't be able to maintain them without being noticed. They wouldn't be able to move them without being noticed. There was a high level of surveillance, and like I say, there was like no questions answered airstrikes whenever they saw something they didn't like. In fact, I believe they reported that 17,000 civilians were killed in the no-fly zones during that time from 1992 to 2003. So there were, I'm sure, a lot of mistakes made. They saw something they thought was some Iraqi government installation. Maybe it was somebody just building a home or expanding a home, or I don't know, putting in some infrastructure for their property, and it was interpreted as something that was dangerous. It was taken out, and if there were any bricklayers or anyone working nearby, they would have been hit. And so the no-fly zone was a no-go zone for any of those possible weapons of mass destruction. So in the lead up to the Iraq War, they began to search for these weapons, and they had the UN weapons inspector who was going, had his team going to Iraq, and they were combing every possible corner and nook and cranny in Iraq looking for those. So there was already a very strong effort to try to track those down. And so what chemical weapons were they looking for? They were looking for the mustard gas. Was something, I guess, used quite a bit in World War I. There was sarin, VX, which is a nerve agent. I guess one drop of that can be fatal. I guess very similar to fentanyl in a way. Binary precursors, tabun, lewisite, phosgene, and hydrogen cyanide. So none of these chemical weapons absolutely required refrigeration, but what refrigeration does is keep the chemical process, the breakdown within the components. It slows it down, and so that was kind of the key from which I could understand this whole build-up to the Iraq War. So anyway, what chemical weapons were used? I guess in Halibja attack in March 1988. So I guess this was the last time that we have any evidence of any chemical agents or weapons being used. And so we have the confirmed chemical agents used: sulfur mustard gas, sarin. There was tabun, Sarin and Tabun and VX are all nerve agents. The sulfur mustard gas is a blister agent. So I'm not going to go into those chemical weapons and why they're, dangerous and weapons of mass destruction. But anyway, the point is that these were the chemical weapons that we're sure that Saddam Hussein had. And so in the build up to the invasion of Iraq, they began to portray Saddam Hussein as a as this lunatic murderer who would bring widespread destruction and death to many countries. He had no moral limits to what he could do or what weapons he could use. So this was the picture that was painted of Saddam Hussein. So if he had chemical weapons and he wanted to keep them for future attacks, then he needed excuse me, these were all the ones that he was ever going to get, because there was the no-fly zone everywhere in Iraq, was heavily surveilled, down to the last little inch. So he wasn't going to be able to get any more weapons of mass destruction into the country from the heavy surveillance and overflights and all the satellite photos, everything they were doing, taking all these pictures and then going through them, seeing what was going on. So he wasn't going to be able to get more chemical agents into Iraq. So he needed, and so if he was really so crazy and murderous, he would want to keep those chemical agents as long as possible. So what he would have had to do was to put them in some sort of refrigeration to slow down the discomposition of the chemical agents, and then those chemicals would have to be processed in a way that they would be renewed and maintained. Otherwise, even with refrigeration, they would eventually become practically, they would be dangerous, but they would not be weapons. So anyway, this continued to intrigue me about what was going on in the build-up to the war, because going back to this point about Saddam Hussein, if he was really the person that they said he was, that he had to be removed, that he was a danger to world order and to countries and to millions of people, then he would have kept all those chemical weapons in pristine or tip-top condition the best he could. So one of those processes would have been a type of refrigeration. So then I began to put two and two together. We have the no-fly zone. So in the the northern part of Iraq, which was apparently the no-fly zone was protect the Kurds, and the southern no-fly zone was to protect Kuwait. So there was this limited band of area where Saddam Hussein could possibly keep those chemicals and maintain them in tip-top condition to make use of them for what people were proposing, that he had all these evil plans. So you start to put different elements together: the no-fly zone, the surveillance that took place there. So he really only had this narrow band of area where he could store those weapons that he had, apparently. And so then he needed to have a facility where not only they could be refrigerated, but they could be processed in a way that they could be maintained. So all of that would require electricity, a very large amount of electricity. They would be quite a draw on their power grid unless he were to have some form of generators. But to get generators into the country, there would be great difficulty for purchasing them and getting them into the country. And of course, once they're in there, then the Allies are looking to see where those generators are going and what they're doing. So again, we start to eliminate all of these different possibilities of, of how these chemicals could be maintained in secret and maintained over years. So we have the no-fly zone. We have this small area where he could have put them. We have the need, more than likely, for a high amount of energy. So then if we have refrigerators, then we need refrigeration. So we need those refrigerators purchased. We need the Freon. We need the maintenance and replacement of parts. So we start to get a laundry list of things that would be needed to keep those chemical weapons stored and maintained and at their best level, because of course he wasn't going to be able to get any more from outside if he wanted to. So he had to maintain those which he had. If this was truly the case, that Saddam Hussein was this crazed madman with a murderous streak. So anyway, and of course the consequence of not maintaining it, for the sulfur mustard gas, it breaks down. It is no longer, it's still harmful, but it begins to degrade to the point that it's no longer as dangerous. So it wouldn't be necessarily a weapon, so it's more like a toxic waste instead of a weapon. Sarin gas, it becomes essentially dead. Taboon, it also becomes functionally useless if not properly maintained. So if Iraq once had those agents, their continued existence as usable weapons is highly unlikely. This was the conclusion of the UN inspectors. So we start to corroborate the conclusions given by the UN inspectors. And but anyway, what I was looking at was the examination of a large refrigerated units, because if Saddam Hussein really wanted to keep those, he would hide them in facilities embedded within civilian areas so that they would be as undetectable as possible. He wouldn't simply put it out in the middle of nowhere and create this facility. So let's say he tries to put that facility embedded in a civilian area. Well, then everyone around that facility, they may have a refrigerator. Most people in Iraq, at least in Baghdad, would have a refrigerator. You may have a air conditioner, but then you start looking at the other household electronics. You'd probably have a TV, refrigerator, and possibly a stove, but the stove could be gas. So not necessarily electric. But the point is that in the homes in Iraq, they're not drawing a huge amount of electricity. And then you put a facility in the middle of that residential area, and it begins to draw huge amounts of electricity. Then that is standing out as like a sore thumb to within that power grid. And what I knew was that the Allies were monitoring the power grid, so they knew where the power was going, what was drawing energy. They wanted to see anything that Saddam Hussein was doing to build, create, that was not, that was secret. So they were monitoring the power grid, and of course, a large facility that was drawing huge amounts of electricity, whether it was simply to keep the lights on in a large facility, whether it was, the ventilation, whether it was all the equipment that they would be using, whether it be the refrigerators that they would be using, that would be a huge draw on the power grid. So anyway, then all these things began to stack up in my mind, and I didn't see anyone addressing that question. I'm like, is it me, or maybe I misunderstand this topic? So then the build up began to take momentum. It's like that little snowball you see at the top of the mountain, and you just push it and it begins to roll, and it begins to increase in size and increase in size. And as the case was created to invade Iraq, the snowball picked up speed, began to grow in size, and then now the news agencies began to carry the narrative that Saddam Hussein was a danger to humanity. He had to be removed as soon as possible. We had to invade. And then they began to ask, this will be expensive for the American people, and what's going to happen in Iraq and all that. And they said, well, the Iraq oil is going to pay for it. And it just sounded like so easy. And no one was asking any decent questions. So I started to understand that the news media had completely given up on trying to investigate and get to the bottom of all these push to invade Iraq. And so see if there's something else that is significant I have here. So basically, during the Clinton administration, they were focusing on, the fact that they didn't know where those weapons of mass destruction were that they knew that Saddam Hussein had, but they were focused on containing, sanctioning, and inspecting. So when George Bush came in, he changed the narrative. He asserted that there were active stockpiles. And of course, to have an active stockpile, the nerve agents and the mustard gas, and that it all needs to have been maintained for 15 years, from 1988 to 2002, 2003. So it would have had to be maintained at, and so in order to maintain that, they would have needed a large amounts of electricity, and they were already supervising and monitoring the power grid. So how is it that they're keeping these chemicals in the most usable form, and at the same time they wouldn't be using all this electricity? So if they were monitoring the power grid, then they knew pretty much where those chemicals would have been stored, and they would have been able to focus in on a particular area and then investigate. So maybe because of the chaotic power grid in Iraq, they couldn't pinpoint the exact location, but they certainly could have an idea that there was a lot more power being used in a specific area than would have been normally used. Because I go back to this point about the Iraqis, it's not like they had, everyone had an air conditioner and everyone had, a washer and dryer, and not like everyone had these, they probably had some sort of refrigerator, but all these other energy draining appliances they wouldn't have had. So you have, all these houses with small energy draw, and then in this area you have a massive energy draw. So they would have known, at least from the zone where there was a anomaly. So anyway, all of that just began to paint a very strong picture that this narrative was being created, and the news media was not investigating these possibilities, and they were simply becoming cheerleaders for the Bush administration to build this case for the invasion. They began to talk about how evil Saddam Hussein was and how much he had to be removed, how great he was a danger, and for even the United States, he could pose a danger to the United States or Israel or any other country. So and I think the final straw was when they gave the evidence in the United Nations Security Council, and they began to pull out all this evidence, which was quickly contested by some independent voices. So it just became very clear that there was really no usable weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and this whole lead up to the war that of the weapons of mass destruction was a lie. It was a lie created by the Bush administration, and it was given validity by the news media, who had bought on to this whole narrative, in part because it was bringing them a lot of coverage, it was bringing them a lot of advertising, and so basically they could just jump on board with this whole narrative and push it until the case for this war basically was assured. So it was very clear for me from the get-go, with all the factors I had understood about Iraq, about the no-fly zone, about the power grid monitoring, about the fact that Saddam Hussein couldn't get updated chemical weapons, so he had to maintain the ones he had, and the huge amount of power that would have required for all the equipment, for the possible refrigeration. So in the end, I had a very clear idea that this war was a total lie, and that the case was just created, to get us to the point of agreeing to the conflict. And once U.S. soldiers were on the ground, no one was asking any more questions about these weapons of mass destruction and why we had arrived to the conclusion that they had them, that they had active stockpiles, that they were an imminent threat to humanity, especially the United States and Israel. So anyway, that concludes my video about how I knew that the Iraq War was a lie. And if you have any comments to make, please do so below. I would appreciate it. And if you like this video, please share. And thanks for your subscription to this channel. You help this channel to grow. We're at 300 subscribers. I have a goal of getting to 1,500 subscribers within 60 days. So a big ask, but thank you. If you would like to let family and friends know about my channel, I'd really appreciate it. So thanks again. And again, if you have any comments to make, please do so below. And I wish you a wonderful day. Take care.